I'm delighted to be joined today by Chris Mitchell. He's the Vice President of Government Relations at IPC. Nice to see you, Chris.
It's great to be with you again, Trevor.
Yeah, it's always nice to catch up every Apex. Now, there's a lot going on around the world with governments. There's quite a few governments now looking at electronics as part of their strategic requirement, to have some capability there. Of course, there's the US CHIPS Act over here in America, and the EU CHIPS Act over in Europe. IPC's called for a silicon to systems approach. Do you think that these governments are actually taking a silicon to systems approach, or are they still too focused on the chip manufacturing?
Yeah, unfortunately, while we're seeing progress, what we still continue to see is a silicon-only mindset.
Right.
And so, again, we're making progress. This is an educational effort. The fact of the matter is many policymakers simply just don't understand the electronic supply chain.
Right.
And so it's really incumbent upon industry to be able to educate them, help them understand the different segments of the industry, and why ultimately, if you want industrial resiliency, if you want economic competitiveness, national security, you need to make sure that you're adopting a silicon to system approach that really does strengthen the entire electronics ecosystem. Again, I don't think that's happening yet.
Right.
And it's unfortunate from my perspective, because if you look at the CHIPS Act really does have the potential to catalyze growth across the entire ecosystem.
Yes.
But right now, if you talk to a PCB company, if you talk to an EMS company, what they're going to tell you is that the CHIPS Act is not about them. And unfortunately, I think that is by and large the truth. We've had conversations with the Commerce Department, for example, and the Commerce Department has made clear that right now, the CHIPS Act is about helping to grow the semiconductor industry, and that we need to look at other opportunities to support these other segments of the industry. Now, that could be a CHIPS 2 at some point here in the United States, but it is what it is, and I think it's unfortunate. Some lost opportunity.
Right.
I will say that, again, here in the United States, what you're seeing is some leadership on the part of the Defense Department. And why is the Defense Department leading on these issues? Because they understand best where the vulnerabilities are in the supply chain. They are talking to the defense primes. And so they know, for example, that though we are putting ourselves in the position of being able to fabricate the most cutting-edge semiconductor chips, we don't necessarily have the capabilities to produce those UHDI printed circuit boards here in the United States to accommodate those chips.
Yeah.
And so they're hearing it, and again, I think that they're trying to make some strategic investments. I wish it was across government, and really what I would love to see is government speak very clearly about the need for this more robust ecosystem, because ultimately, nobody buys semiconductor chips. They buy
the whole
smartphones,
package.
they buy systems.
Absolutely. And I mean, going back to the point about security, I mean, we actually ran an article that came out of Electronic Times recently where a senior government person was actually claiming that the PCBs are one of the most vulnerable parts of the system at the moment. There's quite a security risk there. So really, we really need to get our own capability in PCBs, whether it's here in the United States, independently in Europe, or working together in some sort of form to make that happen. So, I mean, what other parts do you think are missing out of that value chain?
In terms of creating the more robust ecosystem?
Yeah.
I mean, again, I think that we've looked at the PCB industry as an area where the vulnerabilities are not just clear today; they were clear 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? And so there's a lot of inaction for which we should have only regret. But then I think you look at the electronic assembly industry. I mean, we're starting to see how the advancements being made on the component side, it's placing demands across the entire supply chain, the entire value chain. Right. And as a result, companies are having to step up their capabilities, and it's pushing the boundaries of what we have historically been able to do in these segments of the industry. And so, interestingly, IPC and INEMI recently collaborated on a report regarding complex integrated systems.
Correct.
And again, I think it speaks to the fact that these advancements on the chip side really have implications for everybody. And it's just sometimes it takes a little time to understand what those implications are. But we're probably not doing enough in Europe or North America to really tackle those challenges.
We've got a panel discussion tomorrow morning that's going to go into these complex integrated systems, which is there's quite a lot to it actually. It's quite interesting. But no, on the one of the other areas I was thinking is on OSAT, where you're getting assembly of back-end packaging components and things like that. Some of the manufacturers, the EMS guys, are starting to bring in clean rooms into their factories, but there's not an awful lot of that going on. In other words, but in other parts of the world, they're pushing quite hard. I mean, in India, for example, they're opening OSATs in quite a lick, really. There's one company opening 7 right across the country.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It's quite incredible.
These facilities are a huge investment, and I think what we've seen in the U.S. is that, and I think the same is true for Europe, right? That the stakes are so great that you need to make sure that you have the customers there. You'll have the demand, and I think that explains a lot why we haven't seen more investments in the substrate, IC substrates and OSATs here in North America and Europe, and so we need to figure out how do we catalyze that demand.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, there is, a small initiative coming out. There's a PCB Act that's starting to make its way through Congress at the moment. What do you think that will bring?
It's I would love to sit here today and tell you that we're on the cusp of getting that legislation passed. But again, I think it speaks to the fact that people really don't understand this industry well enough, and they don't understand the steps that we need to be taking in order to strengthen it. So it's tough. There's chips fatigue on Capitol Hill right now. And so the idea of passing yet another piece of legislation that has both a tax provision and a subsidy program, it's with the two parties you run into different hurdles. On the other hand, I think we're making progress, and ultimately I'm confident that it may not be this year, given that it's an election year, but I think we're moving in the right direction. I think we have individuals on Capitol Hill today that understand that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and more we're seeing officials on the executive branch side recognize that and signal to the Hill that they would welcome legislation. Again, we have a ways to go, but we're making progress.
Right. Okay. I mean, one of the other areas that obviously is important is bringing back, is getting some of the expertise that we need for some of these high-end factories, whether it's the chip factories or whether it's even high-end PCB manufacturing. And recently, the Dutch government had an issue where they literally had to do a very expensive U-turn on their policy for the equivalent of H-1B visas. Do you think, with the approach to H-1B visas over here, do you think that's a potential barrier, or do you think that's, is the government's going to have to take a more pragmatic approach to it?
I mean, it's certainly a barrier, and I think that the government will have to take a more pragmatic approach if we're going to attract the kind of talent that we need for this industry just in the near term. Ultimately, there are a number of things the government needs to be doing to support a more robust workforce. And if you look at this industry, this is not an industry that's had a strong pipeline for people to enter into the industry, and then once they're in the industry, not the kind of standardized workforce roles and stackable portable credentialing programs to help support upskilling. And so there's a lot that we need to do on this front. It's exciting at IPC. We're really working with the industry to develop those job roles and then to get government behind supporting the growth of the workforce consistent with those job roles.
Right.
So we just in late last year had two programs registered by the Department of Labor for the apprenticeship, federally registered apprenticeship programs, and we have a number of other exciting developments along the workforce front. And again, so I think my point is that while on the immigration side, I think there is a need to be pragmatic and to understand that if we want to keep the pace of innovation, the pace of manufacturing capacity increasing, there's going to need to be some short-term steps we take.
Yeah.
At the same time, we need to be thinking about what the long-term investments are, and we need to be making them now.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. So, final question, Chris. We've had a situation where we've had a lot of tariffs being put on goods coming from China and other places like that. Do they really help the industry? And what can IPC do to try and influence governments on this?
Yeah, it's a tough issue. I think about the tariffs that were placed on printed circuit boards during the Trump administration, and arguably some of those tariffs helped to boost some of the demand domestically for the printed circuit board industry. On the other hand, it had the effect of moving some of the contract assembly work that had been done in the United States to Mexico or elsewhere in the world. Yeah. So this is a really dynamic supply chain that oftentimes it's very difficult to anticipate what kind of effect tariffs will have on other parts of the industry. And so I think it is important for policymakers to understand that helping one segment of the industry is going to have adverse impacts on other parts of the industry. Yeah. But I think there are definitely ways in which we can help to support the growth of the industry in ways that aren't necessarily tariff related. I mean, the PCB bill is a very good example of that. Right. In that legislation, a 25% tax credit is given to individuals that to U.S. taxpayers that source a domestically made printed circuit board. Yeah. Right? So I think there are a number of steps that we need to take. I think the most important point that I guess I would offer is that there is no silver bullet solution. I think everybody wants that silver bullet solution. That's right. One doesn't exist. It's a matter of looking at many tools in the toolbox and figuring out how do you use as many of those tools in order to support the kind of robust industry we want to see in the U.S., in Europe, and Asia. Right, absolutely. It's going to be an ongoing story. There's an awful lot of parts to it, for sure. But I think the work that you're doing with IPC is fantastic, both here in the U.S. and, of course, in Europe. And I want to thank you for coming in and talking about it today. Great. Thanks, Trevor.